This video was brought to you by Ground News. For the last few weeks, France has been consumed by nationwide protests against Emmanuel Macron's pension reforms, which plan to simplify France's convoluted pension system and, more significantly, increase the pension age from 62 to 64. Despite the massive protests, though, President Macron has stubbornly persisted, and on Thursday he took things a step further by using a constitutional technicality to force his reforms through the National Assembly without a vote. As you'd expect, this has triggered a furious reaction from both the French public and opposition parties, who are now trying to bring down the government. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Macron's pension reforms, why they've gone down so badly in France, and whether this could be the end of Emmanuel Macron. To understand why the French are quite so grumpy about pension reform, you're going to need a bit of context. France's retirement age was originally cut from 65 to 60 in the early 1980s under socialist president François Mitterrand. And basically every French president since then has struggled to overhaul this change. President Jacques Chirac's right-wing government tried to overhaul the pension system in 1995, but was met with such intense protests and strikes that these reforms were dropped. His successor, President Nicolas Sarkozy, also on the right, managed to increase the retirement age from 60 to 62, but it took months of authority-sapping nationwide strikes and protests to even achieve this. Then President François Hollande, Sarkozy's socialist successor, somewhat sneakily reformed the system by leaving the headline minimum retirement age at 62 in place, but enacting a gradual increase in contribution years required to receive a full pension. Then, though, it was Emmanuel Macron's turn to try and tinker with the system. In 2019, he originally wanted to do a complete overhaul of the system by unifying 42 special pensions regimes that covered 42 different sectors. Now, this unsurprisingly sparked nationwide protests and strikes, which, coupled with the COVID pandemic, which broke out not long after, forced the government to rethink its priorities and shelve the reform. Then, during his re-election campaign in 2022, he pledged to increase the minimum retirement age from 62 to 65, but suggested that he'd be willing to compromise on 64 instead. Regardless, Macron was duly re-elected last year, and, well, that brings us to now. The French government's current proposed reform is to increase the minimum retirement age from 62 to 64 and increase the number of years of work required to earn a full pension to 43. These reforms will be implemented gradually, though, by 2030 and 2027 respectively. The reforms would also bring an end to many so-called special regimes with different requirement ages for different professions, including railway, electricity, and gas workers. However, lower retirement ages would be maintained for certain categories of workers, including police and firefighters, whose jobs are deemed physically or mentally arduous enough to justify this. The government would also increase the guaranteed minimum pension for low-income workers to 85% of net minimum wage. Altogether, the government argues that these changes are necessary to ensure that the pension system is financially viable and prevent a major financial deficit in the future, when the French population continues to get older. The new system would also bring France more in line with the rest of Western Europe, where the pension age is generally between 65 and 67. However, that doesn't mean that the French people like it, with polling suggesting that some 2/3 of the French public oppose these reforms. And for months now, there have been widespread strikes and protests against them. In fact, France's 8 main trade union bodies have been unusually united, and there have been multiple days of national action across the country. Nonetheless, though, on Sunday, the Conservative-dominated Senate voted through the reforms by 195 votes to 112. Moving them to a final decisive vote in the National Assembly, which was due to take place on Thursday. Now, this vote was always going to be tough for the government. Macron lost his majority last year, and the two largest opposition groups, the left-wing NUPES alliance and the far-right National Rally, were both vehemently opposed to the government's proposal. So, despite receiving Senate approval, it looked unlikely it was going to progress any further than this, at least if there had to be a vote. So, when it became clear that the government lacked a majority on this issue, Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne announced that she would trigger Article 49.3 of the French Constitution to force through the bill without a vote. Now, this didn't go down too well with the opposition, who sang the national anthem in the Assembly to prevent her from announcing the declaration. Now, Article 49.3 is an article of the French Constitution which basically allows the government to turn any bill into a no-confidence vote. Essentially, this means that the government can force its legislation through without a vote, but in return, opposition lawmakers will have 24 hours to file a no-confidence motion in the government. Now, the use of Article 49.3 is by no means unprecedented. In fact, this marks the 100th time it's been used since its introduction in 1958. But this is certainly a risky move by the government, and that's because both the public and the opposition have reacted furiously to its implementation. Macron's far-right rival Marine Le Pen described it as a total failure, and the Communist Party's leader claimed that Parliament had been ridiculed and humiliated. It wasn't just politicians, though. Almost immediately after the announcement, riots kicked off across France, including near the National Assembly. And this isn't just an isolated incident either. Polling suggests that over 80% of the French public think that this move was a mistake, not least because multiple government politicians promised that this mechanism wouldn't be used just weeks beforehand. And the opposition parties have taken notice of this anger, so they've already tabled confidence motions in the government, known as motions of censure, which will probably be voted on early next week. If successful, this could annul the pension reforms, trigger the fall of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, and probably force Macron to call new parliamentary elections. However, that being said, history suggests that censure motions are unlikely to succeed. Even since Macron's alliance lost its majority last year, every no-confidence vote against his government has failed. And that's because, generally speaking, these people just don't get on all that well. The left don't want to vote for motions tabled by the right don't want to vote for motions tabled by the left, and the mainstream conservative Republicans don't want to vote for anything which will bring down the government, especially not hand-in-hand with the hard left or far right. So, with the left-wing NUPES alliance and far-right National Rally both quickly confirming that they would be tabling motions of censure, that same dynamic looks likely to play out once again. But this time round, something different is happening. A small regionalist grouping in the National Assembly called Liberties, Independence, Overseas and Territories have also filed a cross-partisan motion of censure that has already won support from the NUPES alliance and the National Rally. However, even with this unusual unified support, they still need the Republicans' support to reach the 50% threshold of 287 votes. As such, 30 Republican lawmakers would need to back the motion if it has any chance of succeeding. But since the party's boss has said that the party will not back any censure motions, this doesn't look likely to succeed, even given the newfound cross-party unity. However, that doesn't mean that Macron is safe by any means. It's entirely possible that some Republicans break rank to vote to bring down the government. Those MPs might reason that while they don't necessarily want to bring down the government, they don't really want to be associated with the pension reforms or the controversial use of Article 49.3. So they might be tempted to vote for the censure motion as the lesser of two evils. And this is especially likely to happen if massive protests continue with the same vigor, which could spook some Republican MPs. All in all then, while invoking the nuclear option of Article 49.3 might have got Macron's flagship reform over the line, his political trouble is far from over. And next week looks like it's lining up to be make or break for him. And if you want to follow that as it unfolds, the best way to do so is with ground news. Ground News is a website and app that lets you compare how breaking news is covered around the world. That's because for every story, you get bias, factuality, and ownership ratings for the news sources that are reporting on the topic. That makes it a fantastic way to access global news from a diverse array of viewpoints, so that you can see how international stories are being covered by news outlets on the ground or in neighboring countries. For example, I can quickly compare headlines from government-affiliated sources to get a sense of how governments, even democratically elected ones, can steer media coverage. And Ground News truly is global. They have several editions to make sure that you're getting the news that is relevant to your region, including 4,000 news sources here in the UK alone. And if you want more than that, an even more customized experience, then you can follow specific people, places, or topics that interest you most, like politics, Europe, or the economy. It's really a fascinating way to read the news. It gives you a variety of sources and far more information about the news than any other app out there. So if you want to give it a try, you should head over to ground.news/TLDR, where you can subscribe to get unlimited access to all of their features and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.